My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I am joined by two very special guests. The first has been a repeat guest on the show and has provided us with, a wealth of information to consider and apply to training. So it's always great to have him back to share his expertise with us. So Kevin, this is probably the most generous introduction you've ever gotten on this podcast. So I'm assuming you're beaming right now and you can't wait to record this episode.
I mean, it kind of caught me off guard. I think it's the first positive introduction I've gotten on the, I understand that there's going to be some, weightlifters are always jealous of powerlifters and their general strength and physical feat. So it's kind of expected at this point.
Yeah, I like to think that I fulfill expectations pretty easily. I don't go above and beyond or below and under, so that's kind of how I'm known. So the second guest we'll have today is Keith Davids. I could rattle off Keith's CV, but I feel like I'd do a disservice to his expertise and experience in the field. So Keith, thanks again for joining us, planning this out. And once again, how's your morning been so far?
Great so far. Greetings. Thanks, Joshua. And hello again, Kevin. Greetings from Sheffield in the UK, where I've had my normal morning of working, which is writing on papers, reading, discussing with colleagues ideas. And then, it's been like that now since for the whole of 2020 into 2021. Probably carry on like that for the next maybe 5 to 6 months or so. It's great to be able to contribute to this podcast.
Yeah, and I guess this is a bit unplanned, and it's kind of how. So my podcast tended to be more focused and outlined, and then as my podcasting expertise, air quotes, have developed, I've kind of shot more from the hip. So this was unplanned, but Keith, knowing that you would be seen as an expert in the field of skill acquisition, and you can correct me if I'm wrong with any of this, but how have you been able to, one, commit so much of your time to it and stay interested in it enough to develop this expertise? Because I know Kevin and I am to a large extent interested in developing expertise within a skill or a task or a sport, also in an intellectual pursuit. And talking to someone like yourself, you've spent a lot of time, a lot of hours researching, studying, trying to gain an understanding of the field and its application to practice. What's that been like, and how have you stayed so interested in it to get to this point? I mean, do you have any key advice for listeners to pursue an interest to the point of becoming an expert? Like, how have you been able to maintain that?
Great question. Actually, that's really good. It's essentially, I would say, I'd start off by saying that essentially it's an individualized path. Mm-hmm. So if you come across anybody else who you wonder about how they became so knowledgeable, so skillful or experienced, it's not necessarily straightforward to copy what they did. But clearly, you're right. There are some pointers, some ideas that you could take on board. And actually, one of them, we had a quick discussion beforehand before we got on online, Josh, and you made the comment about being obsessive, i.e. passionately interested in a very positive way about a topic, an area, and wanting to know a lot about it. I'm not saying everything about it because it's, the idea about things in life, including knowledge and skills and expertise, is they're dynamic. They're constantly changing. They're constantly being shaped and influenced by all sorts of constraints, social constraints, new knowledge, new ideas, that sort of thing. And so, really, I think just being passionately interested in one area and then being very open to the area changing because of new ideas, new advances, and the influences of other people in your field.
Yeah. And I think, in an intellectual pursuit, it's nice because you kind of just leave it up to yourself to develop that. Like no one can kind of change the amount of studying you do or the sources you look at. I mean, they can like indirectly, but you can spend a lot of time obsessing or like passionately enjoying something and reading about it and consuming it. But in the sports world, you have to rely on people, on individuals who want to participate to develop that. So Kevin, kind of flipping that question a little bit, in the practical side of things in powerlifting, how have you managed to stay so interested in powerlifting and continue to pursue it, given trials and tribulations of dealing with people in real world situations with the constraints of everyone else's lives kind of revolving around your own?
Oh man, that's it's kind of a question I've never really thought about before, where I don't know, I've just always had like I think my background in athletics to begin with, right? So like playing soccer through college, doing the pro MMA stuff for a decade after that, and then getting into powerlifting later in life. I've just always had this, like, I've been surrounded by high level athletes from the time I was a kid all the way up into adulthood. So I think I've always just had this fascination with like skill acquisition, right? Just because there are times where it's like, I'm faster than that kid, I'm stronger than that kid, but why is he better than me? So I think it like started my actual like intellectual pursuit of it almost started at an earlier age when I'm asking these questions, not necessarily maybe learning about it. And then, undergrad and grad school, I kind of dove in a little bit deeper with that stuff. I think it's a real hard struggle for a sport like powerlifting because people, they don't necessarily start at the time that they're 5 years old and then work their way up through. So it's challenging in a couple of ways. One, I think in a lot of cases, they don't know what they're getting into. So if you're trying to show your expertise as a coach or even an intellectual with a group of people who are just hobbyists, there's like this disconnect that happens and it can become extremely frustrating. So just kind of understanding that the dynamics of coaching a multitude of people, it just becomes this learned skill of, hey, this person's never going to be a world champion, so maybe I gotta pull back a little bit. I have to readjust. And then the other aspect of it is when they're starting to learn later in life, like you just hope that somebody played a high school sport so that they have developed some type of like movement strategies and some type of like explosive power, and like that there's just something there to work with, because trying to teach a new skill to somebody in their late 20s, early 30s, it's a real challenge, and it's a fun challenge as a coach in that case there. And then like we have to balance this. So most people who join powerlifting last 3 to 5 years. So then it becomes this, well, how much skill practice do I want to put in, and how much stimulus do I just want to throw at somebody? Because over the course of 3 to 5 years, maybe we can just keep throwing some stuff at them. They see enough progress, they quit, they're happy with everything that happens. Or if we take somebody from the beginning and we start putting them into positions to teach them those like fundamental skills like you would with almost a child just getting into it at the same time, are they going to get frustrated and they're going to want to stick with it? Because ultimately, if they don't stick with it, your plan doesn't work. So like the practicality of it, like in a lot of cases, I think a lot of stuff looks really intellectual and good on paper. But when it comes time to like practically apply it, it becomes extremely difficult. And it's like this, every decision you make is a give and take. So if I'm going to really pull back and teach some of the basic fundamentals, the give is going to be, they're not going to get as strong as fast as if I did it another way. And I think that's where just communication and the coach athlete relationship and those things become important. And over time, I've just gone like back and forth, and it's like, it's a really hard task because as a coach, I need to make money and do all of that stuff. But at the same time, I have these like values that I hold dear in terms of how I want to coach the sport and what I believe to be the best way to go about it. So it's like a constant struggle kind of, I guess, between the ecological dynamics between like just coach, lifter, and the state of an amateur sport.
Yeah, I get that. And I think a lot of it, again, is the barrier to entry is so small. You can kind of just walk into a gym and sign up, and suddenly, you're a power lifter or weightlifter, and you're able to pursue that. Whereas, if you want to play a sport at a college level, there's kind of that like natural progression that has to lead you up to that point. By the time you've made it, you probably won't quit for some kind of silly reasons. So you'll show more disciplined commitment. And I like the fact that you brought up skill acquisition a handful of times. And that's the exact reason, we wanted to have this chat with Keith today, is to talk about skill acquisition. And ultimately, this whole thing revolves around, one, getting the most out of someone's time within a sport, right? Maximizing the usefulness of their participation time. And what that means is you're maximizing technical efficiency, and you're increasing you're maximizing kind of the physical qualities that are most involved with the sport. So in powerlifting, that's kind of looking at like absolute strength or maximal strength, and in weightlifting, that's kind of like rate of force development, given all of the other variables. But an equally important component is that technical piece. How do you teach a skill? How do you learn a skill? And how do you apply that in different settings, under different pressures, with different constraints? So with all of that being said, to kind of start us off, Keith, before we start getting into the meat and potatoes of the podcast, maybe you could just, for our listeners, give us your background, how you became interested in the concept of skill acquisition, and what your time kind of studying it has looked like up to this point.
Yeah, it was interesting listening to Kevin, actually, because you can mirror that in academic circles as well, the development of in academic circles. I became interested in sports science. I didn't know it was sports science at the time because it hadn't been invented yet. I started training as a physical education teacher at a college at London University, which it was a sort of a college affiliated to London University on the edge of London, a beautiful suburb. And funnily enough, I went there and I was thinking, I wonder if I could still make it as a football player, a soccer player type of thing. But I played against other people at that level and realized, no, I wasn't going to make it there. But, funny enough, what interested me, what really grabbed me, was the theory. I remember some of my contemporaries, people, my peers in the same class group and older years, used to mock me and tease me a bit because I was very interested in reading these books about the physiology, the anatomy, understanding how the body worked, and obviously I was grabbed by motor learning because, like Kevin said, how come I looked at other people and I just thought, I would like to do what that person does on a soccer field. I can't do it. Why can't I do it? And I practice and practice and practice. And I knew that, so that there's something going on. You know that you need to know more. And I guess it goes back to Kevin's point about when he's working with people, etc., and trying to get them to be the best that they can be. And that, to me, is how I got into the more scientific side of it. Whilst even before this was 1972. I started 75. The first sports science course at Liverpool started up, and I got into the different aspects of science accidentally because I wanted to be the best that I could be. Because I knew I couldn't be the top athlete in my area, but I was fascinated by understanding how someone could become that good, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's quite a while ago too, talking about the 1970s and then kind of up into this point. I'm assuming a lot has happened between then, and you've done, obviously, anyone who, types your name in Google Scholar or ResearchGate or whatever kind of platform that they could search articles would find a wealth of stuff you've written on and studied. Maybe you could just give us an overview of kind of how directed your research has been, the specific questions you've been looking to answer, and how you've gone about kind of finding answers to those questions.
I'll take you back to the 70s again, and actually probably even earlier than the 70s if you guys can go that far back. When I first got into motor learning, skill acquisition there were some really good textbooks coming out of the US, actually. There was one by Bob Singer, Florida State University, that was influential in my development, in understanding of motor learning, motor development, and then obviously the theories, the books of Richard Schmidt, Jack Adams, different theories, different approaches to understanding. It was motor control, so it was essentially the information processing approach, or the cognitive approach, it was called, which treated the brain as a computer. And like any computer, it's only as good as the software and, of course, the hardware that you've got, but the software that you put into it. And the software are the programs that you learn. So the idea back then was that you control a movement by your brain writing a better so-called motor program that controls the movement parameters. So with a lifting movement, a weightlifting movement, the technique was elaborated in a motor program, and that came through specific knowledge, specific instruction, very specific practice, so that you developed a motor program for a powerlifting movement or some sort of weightlifting movement, a snatch, a clean and jerk or whatever, rather than, say, a motor program for a volleyball spike or a football volley or something like that. So that's, in those days, those were the initial ideas about how you became skillful. You basically practice hard enough so that your brain developed better and better programs, more elaborate, more sophisticated programs that controlled your movements. That's how it started.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. And I think the most fascinating thing for me is how you can have such a wide variety of skills, and based on that based on that theory or that kind of logic, to have them all tucked away specifically within their own, certain part of the I guess the nervous system, and how you can recall them kind of at will, and have all of them working individually. Because, sometimes coaches, I know I have done this in the past, but you can get into the nuances of the difference between movements and how much of a difference makes a difference, right? With the way the body handles it. So if we talk about like a basic barbell squat, what does widening your feet, your stance width, do to the squat? How does that change it? Does that change, and obviously it changes like the forces that are applied to the actual tissues. But how does it change like the skill component of it? What about moving the bar around? What about adding in, a pause? And these are things that seemingly seem like small questions, but that actually have brought up some contention in weightlifting. I know there are certain coaches who don't use pause squats. So like stop squats, where you squat down to the bottom and you hold for a certain number of seconds and then you come up, because they think it will interfere with the skill of catching that bounce in the bottom of a squat. So they're eliminating exercises that are very similar, with the idea that like these motor programs are easily influenced, for the good and bad. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
yeah, I think it relates to where I paused. I mean, I didn't go too far back because I don't want to overload listeners with the whole history of motor learning all within 5 minutes. But I paused at the idea that actually specificity is really important for programming movements. And I think you alluded to that, Joshua. So how specific does this movement need to be? And of course, if you think about it from computer logic, so I'll take you back a bit further than the 70s. So we go back to the Second World War, and there was a challenge for the Allied forces. So in Britain and in the US, there was a challenge there against the opponents, was actually about producing better technology. So sophisticated engineering at the time, the tanks, the planes, the radar systems, the submarines, the warships, etc. To really produce that, to work on new technology. It's a bit like modern day, the idea of coronavirus going around and developing the vaccines that need to address these strains quickly, and then getting them out there. And then a new strain arrives, and then working out whether the vaccine needs to be adapted a bit. Can it, deal with the new strain? So it's like a bit of an arms race in comparison. And that's not to try to play down, the severity of the coronavirus pandemic or anything like that. But, it's a kind of a similar rationale like that. So a question that arose in America and in the US was with regards to the technology for this military conflict is, do we train people in using this new technology, which is being developed very, very quickly, or do we select them? Do we identify them? Do you have the skills to be a radar operator? Do you have the skills to and the emotional control to work in a submarine, the enclosed space of a submarine, go down to low depths and spend a lot of your time there? So is it selection or is it training? Excuse me. And to answer that question, what they did was they brought on campus, university campuses in the UK and in the US, they brought engineers and psychologists together. So the engineers were going to be the ones who obviously developed the technology, made it user-friendly, etc. And they worked with psychologists to work on this issue of learning or selection. And so from that interaction on these university campuses in the Second World War came this sort of information processing cognitive approach to movement control, which saw the brain as a form of computer, was just in its infancy at the time, as we know. And in 1955, there was a symposium, a very famous symposium called the Hickson Symposium. And the Hickson Symposium basically was the first symposium which attributed the idea that that the brain is a computer and we have this information processing approach. And it wasn't just, the Hickson Symposium wasn't just devoted to understanding how movements are controlled and skills are acquired. It was really about the brain and behavior more generally. And from there then, that's when these ideas started to foment. And then a decade or so, 2 decades later, these textbooks started to come out, which really espouse these ideas, because the obviously governments were interested in taking these ideas forward a bit more. So I'll pause there to let people catch up with that information. So at the time then, of course, you treat I just summarize it by saying, so the brain is a computer, and therefore, how do you coordinate your actions? How do you control your movements? And how do we then train people to control their movements and learn new movements? Those were the questions that arose from those interactions.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, feel free to jump in at any point if you have any questions.
Yeah, my head's spinning a little bit. So getting back to the pause squats, right, and the specificity of things. What I think gets missed in terms of this, and it might even, and this is the history of it, where maybe we put a specific input in, and like with a computer program, like what input is going to give you an output. Mm-hmm. So it kind of gives you this like very controlled, comfortable setting, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But like even if you're trying to even if the stretch reflex, right, and you're pausing, the slower speeds decrease noise within the movement system, right? And if you have two-way communication between the tissue and the brain, so you get that top-down and that bottom-up communication, part of that communication probably exists with the certain strength features in terms of like motor units available, the forces that are on the system, the forces the system's capable of handling. So like when I start thinking about like maybe using a wide stance pause squat to do something, and of course there's physiological adaptations that happen, right? You're shortening the range of motion, so you're doing less work, there's more hip involvement. But over time, perhaps if the hips were weaker, let's say, but you're building them up in those positions, that communication is going to be given to that top-down movement strategy that's going to be pre-planned before. And like, to me, this is how like behavior change would happen. And from my understanding of how movement's initiated, that it's done in chunking of neurons. So there's this initial tick that sets off this initial chunking, and then there's like this cascade of a pre-planned movement strategy that kind of gets executed into the movement itself. So if we're still performing a lift that's extremely similar in terms of rules, like some people squat at that width, right? Mm-hmm. And if they're hitting depth and they're coming back up and they're kind of equal, it's still specific. And then the specificity needs to be specific to the goal that we're trying to train. So if we're trying to build hypertrophy and we're just doing singles, that's probably not the best. That's probably not specific to the goal that we're attempting to obtain. So I guess my question would be, wouldn't that variability play a role in updating that communication to perhaps enhance the movement strategies that we can manipulate range of motion a little bit better, that those areas? And like my understanding too, like if the lower back tends to be a little bit weaker, but we start adding in good mornings, perhaps that's just updating the communication between the two, where, you know, tissues sending that sensory feedback back to the brain and being like, hey, the lower back's ready for a squat PR or something. Am I off base with this?
Yeah. I think what you're doing there is hitting upon an issue that arose with the first theories of motor programming, which were in the 60s. And there was what these issues did. This is to do with how specific is a motor program, because I think Josh was already alluded to the problem is like, well, how many of these movements are there? How many movement programs are there, and where are they stored? And you know, how do we know that the brain's got so much capacity, and how can we quickly, sort of lock into a program, use a program to control our movements, particularly with in dynamic performance settings where you've got lots of different options. And I think you gave an example, Kevin, where within a fairly stable environment, how things can vary in a stable environment, the interaction between an individual and a weightlifting bar or something like that. But imagine in a dynamic performance environment, if you were, trying to traverse a whitewater rapid in a canoe, a kayak, that sort of thing. So quickly, there became this big debate about specificity of a motor program and generality of a motor program. And that was what dominated things right up until, there were some sort of people starting to refer to different ways of looking at things, i.e. not a sort of the brain as a computer metaphor, avoiding that and going towards the more of a biological approach. But that really was... The debate was dominated by this sort of what type of computer question, really for a couple of decades then up until the sort of early 80s. And then all of a sudden this new alternative emerged. And if I can take you back, Kevin, the variability issue emerged, how do we because if you think about it, if you buy a new computer, the last thing you want from a new computer is somebody to say to you, don't worry, it's got lots of variability in there. Sometimes you'll go to turn it on and it may turn on, may not turn on. You don't need that variability as defined in computer science. So, there clearly needed to be a different conceptualization of what we mean by variability. And that came about because in the 80s, what started to happen particularly in Western scientific literature, I'll explain that in a minute, was that there was a re-emphasis, a refocus on coordination, movement coordination rather than movement control. So all the time before that, we were talking about motor control. How do we control movements? How does this, we write a program that controls the movement, the sequencing of the movement, the timing, the forces produced and that sort of thing. And suddenly people started referring to literature written by, this was theories and data of a Russian movement scientist called Nikolai Bernstein, and his work was conducted in the 1930s and was only translated into English in the late 60s, and then started to get picked up a bit later on after that. And Bernstein's ideas promoted this idea of coordination. Two aspects of coordination, which is you've got this wonderful movement system with many, many different muscles, joints, limb segments, how the central nervous system operates. You can go down even further. You can go down to molecules. Of course, you mentioned neurons before, interconnecting neurons, Kevin. You've got this complex movement system with many, many interacting parts. How do we coordinate together? How do we become skillful in coordinating the many, many different parts? But of course, you know as well as I do that you can produce the most sophisticated coordination patterns between the muscles, joints, limb segments, but it could be completely out of sync with what's going on in the environment. So an action needs to be coordinated to what's going on in the environment as well. There's two aspects or dimensions to coordination. There's coordination of parts of the body in an effective, efficient way, safe way, and then there's coordination of parts of the body with respect to what's going on in the environment. And Bernstein was responsible for the ideas which swung people away from thinking about motor control all the time and thinking about movement coordination and how we acquire movement coordination.
Why do you think there was that lag time? If his work was done in the 30s, and then we've kind of projected ourselves, up a few decades, why wasn't it kind of within the moment as it was unfolding, the field was also changing with it? Or was it just inaccessibility to his writings, and it kind of required finding that, translating it, and then kind of figuring it out before the field could take that turn?
Yeah, it's again a very good pertinent question. Bernstein's work, he had to be go under the radar a bit in Russia because his ideas were a little bit against what the Russian state was espousing then in terms of human behavior and how people should behave in a society. And so he was, he had to be careful about what he wrote and how he wrote it, etc. But then, of course, there is the translation problem to English. And it was when there was Russian immigration to the United States, for example, motor control theorists and neurophysiologists, motor neuroscientists such as Mark Latache, for example, came over and they were fluent in Russian, they could help translate it. And so, it's the availability of these ideas that are different. And interestingly, there are people like Anatoly Bondarchuk, whose ideas are also infiltrating English language a bit more easily, and they're quite pertinent as well. And I think those ideas have relevance to this discussion that we're having, which is essentially about, well, when we practice, how specific do we need to practice? How specifically do we need to be so precise about precise movements? Or what about variability? Can we, because things vary in a performance environment, shouldn't we be preparing our athletes to adapt to the things that vary so they can cope with the changes and the alterations needed? Even in more stable environments, things can vary a little bit. There's thresholds of variations, obviously. But, the idea of just simply rehearsing a movement in a very precise way, which kind of underpins a lot of traditional teaching and coaching, as this is the way we started off this discussion, talking about that. Really, are they barking up the wrong tree? Have they pursued the wrong theoretical scientific model about how we coordinate our actions with respect to the environment? So maybe we can get on to talking about that next, if you want.
Yeah, and I think anyone who has worked with athletes for an extended period of time realize that it isn't as simple as giving them one movement and trying to have them figure it out or to learn the skill. What I've found as a coach who's worked with a number of athletes at this point is the wider the variety of strategies I can use, the larger number of tools, be that like physical manipulation, going and moving them around to get them into the right position, or giving them an exercise, or putting some physical obstruction in their way so that they cannot reproduce the suboptimal movement. A good example is the jerk. So that's a lift where you essentially you have the bar on your shoulders, you drive it up, and then you have to get it overhead, usually by splitting your feet forward and backward in a scissor-like fashion. And people tend to execute that part of it poorly because you're trying to time the back leg and the front leg, and then the timing of catching the bar overhead. So I'll have to put pieces around so that they can't land their feet in certain positions because maybe they're less efficient, or it'll screw up other portions of the lift. I mean, there's such a wide variety of strategies you have to use almost to teach athletes, especially when they come into the sport later. And as Kevin said, again, they haven't developed those foundational skills of basic body awareness and, building up the physical qualities to some extent where they can kind of use them to help move the weights around. So I think that kind of adds to the need for a different approach, removed from that kind of input output fashion of we expose them to something specific and we rehearse it enough times to kind of develop the movement we want to call upon. So I feel like that's where the field is heading, or was heading, when Bernstein's information was kind of read and then disseminated. From that point on, then what changes started to take place, and how did it again start to unfold a bit more, kind of leading us up to, again, more like present day?
Yeah. So people like Bernstein are very influential because they refocused the field, actually. It started slowly, but it's really, really accelerated now. So as I said, instead of talking about motor control and learning, people began to talk about movement coordination and its acquisition, the acquisition of coordination. For example, they also started to talk about the role of variability. What is good variability and what is bad variability? Because it's clear that we're not saying that all variability is good. It's just that in the past, it was considered that all variability was bad. And some variability is actually quite functional because it helps you to adapt. Bernstein, one of the really neat experiments he did was an observational study of a blacksmith hammering a nail into the actual shoe of a horse. And he found a way to analyze the trajectory of the hammer in the air, going backwards, on the upstroke and then on the downstroke, as it were, hitting the nail in. And he showed there was a threshold of variability for the actual movement trajectory of the hammer in space. It wasn't just in a straight up and down, very linear fashion, but there was a sort of a wide range, a wide-ish range for this action. And so this is supposed to be a simple action, which you would think if there was a motor program for controlling it, then the muscle sequencing and everything would be fairly well rehearsed in this. This was an expert blacksmith, by the way, a very highly skilled blacksmith. So he was pointing out that even in a task like that, there was some movement variability available. And so biomechanists started to follow movement scientists to study Bernstein's insights into rethinking, if you like, about movement variability. And what happened then was that skill acquisition theorists started to follow suit, and coaches and teachers, looked into ways that it could be used. My colleague and I, Duarte Rojo, at the University of Lisbon, we wrote a paper back in 2010 where we, tongue-in-cheek, with a clear theoretical point to make, we said perhaps the area of skill acquisition should be renamed skill adaptation rather than skill acquisition, because the idea of skill acquisition comes from a time when you thought that you practice and rehearse things in such a precise way that you acquired something, an entity like a program or a representation of the movement stored somewhere in the brain. And we said we should be focusing on skill adaptation, which is how you adapt your movements in a skilled way so that you satisfy the constraints of the environment that are changing all the time. In order to, like if the angle of the nail in the horseshoe slightly changes, you have to adapt your angle that you approach it to hit it flush into the shoe, rather than just keep hitting in the same way, because you'll end up putting it in a crooked way, for example. So skill adaptation. And if you do acquire anything, perhaps what you acquire in skill acquisition is a more functional relationship with the environment. So even in a fairly stable, reasonably stable performance environment, like lifting a weight, and doing the clean and jerk, and as you pointed out, actually, Joshua, it's not that stable a performance environment. Things can vary, and so you have to kind of there are thresholds for it. But even in that, it could be that you really adapt your movements in order to acquire a more functional relationship, which means that you kind of use variability to satisfy these changes, and you're prepared for things that can change. So what that means for a coach, any coach or teacher, is you need to work out for your sport or activity, what are the things that could vary in performance? And clearly in some sports, like team sports, they could vary really quite drastically, quite radically. In other sports, they can vary a bit, but not as much as that. But there's certain things that could vary. And I really like your example about putting things in the way so that people can get feedback if they tread on something inadvertently, which means that their foot is out of a line and they're in a potentially weak position, and it may be unsafe or whatever. So what varies and how can we then adapt to those things is an issue that teachers and coaches can take away from this discussion so far.
So I kind of want to compare the blacksmith to the pause squats, right? So when we're performing movements, so let's say that it's not an expert blacksmith, but they want to be an expert blacksmith, or we have a weightlifter or powerlifter that wants to be an expert. There's this speed and accuracy trade-off, right? So the faster I move, I might not hit the nail on the head. I might hit my thumb at some point, or if I put it in my left hand, the coordination of my movement's going to be very different, right? Maybe I hit my thumb on one hand and then I have to use my other hand, and I would need that requisite skill at some point, right?
Good example.
For when I think of pause squats, we're decreasing the speed of the movement. We're building certain physiological adaptations, of course, right? But we're adjusting the speed to increase the accuracy, right? So if we're pausing, it is kind of this like makeshift tempo. They're going to slow down. They're going to come to a complete stop, and then they're going to have to get it moving again. So there becomes less noise within that system, and you just see a much more efficient movement pattern. So, but then you have the coaches like you were talking about earlier, Josh, that are like, everything's going to be fast. Everything's going to be fast. And in doing so, they're increasing speed with a decrease of accuracy of their movement. So if we wanted to be an expert blacksmith, would there be some... So the speed of the movement is a constraint, right? So would there be some benefit to slowing it down to increase the accuracy of the movement, to then maybe vary it to the other hand, to then maybe bring it back, and over time kind of build up the strength? Like for me with powerlifting, this is why we use bands on the barbell. We can manipulate the mass of the barbell in a way that allows them to kind of keep fast movement, but it stays accurate because, it's decreasing loads at the more disadvantaged positions of the lifts. But I'm kind of curious about like the speed accuracy trade-off and like building up that skill. And I like the term adaptation.
I think that for me, the relationship between speed and accuracy, it's a well-known relationship. It's been examined in motor learning studies, in laboratory-based studies with very, very kind of small movement patterns, i.e. involving very few degrees of freedom or parts of the body. For example, it could be just finger movements or hand movements and that sort of thing. And it's well established. And for me, it's not for me to tell a coach how to vary the speed accuracy trade-off, because that should vary for each individual and for the different sports. But it's really, I guess, the point of this discussion would be for coaches to think about that and work out if I am slowing a movement down, why am I doing it? Can I explain that? Is there a theoretical rationale for explaining it? Or is it just that, oh, well, this is a type of practice that I've seen other people do. You know, I've watched Kevin Cann teach his learners about it, and I want to copy it. And this is what worries me about a lot of coaching, is that there's a lot of coaching that's handed down, that's sort of, if you like, the practices that people have done time and again, and they look at some sort of model coach that they would like to be, and they want to copy that, but without really understanding what is the rationale behind it. So for me, the speed accuracy trade-off is a good example of skill adaptation, Kevin, absolutely right. But it's most important for the coach to know, at this point, this learner, why do they need to speed things up? Why do they need a more dynamic movement pattern? Why should we slow things down here? And does it need to be the same for every individual? And of course, for each individual in their learning strategy, it's not a linear process. So you can go back. You can go back and you can slow things down. Maybe that you're recovering from an injury. It may be that there's some sort of loss of form or confidence. And, you would, as coaches, you would have many better examples about this. So see things as a continuum rather than as an either or. And so the speed accuracy trade-off is one example of where you can explore different aspects of a practice task design, but you should have a theoretical rationale for it. And if I could just take you back, we've been talking about the importance of specificity of practice, which is absolutely correct. It's really important. If you want to become skillful at some sort of weightlifting or powerlifting movement, you have to practice that specifically. And if you practice the volleyball smash or the volleyball set or dig, that may not help you to become good at a weightlifting movement. So that's what we mean by specificity of practice. But you can over-specialize and practice too specifically. And I've heard you two guys mention really, really well some examples where you've talked about people having a good repertoire, general skills, a foundation of movement skills. So the generality of practice, I think, has been underplayed over the years. So that's another example of this sort of trade-off that people have resolved and said, oh, now that you're an adult, now that you've reached a certain level of competence, you should be practicing in a highly specific way all the time. That's not necessarily the case, because you can move back and forth along the continuum, but you need to understand why you're doing it and what you're trying to get out of it for, with an athlete, if you see what I mean. And maybe we can discuss that next, unless we've not dealt with the speed accuracy issue enough, Kevin.
No, I think that's a great place to go from here.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious to know, because we talk about specificity. So we know that practicing the skill specifically as it's performed will influence the skill as it's performed. But how far away from that, and this is just more curiosity, how far away from that can you get before you start to positively or negatively influence the skill? So, because examples come to mind where coaches might, selectively say, we don't do these movements because they negatively influence the competition performance. But there's so many movements that they use, and I don't know if they necessarily give those a thought as if they influence the competition performance. I recognize complexity, and I just wonder, how can we really wrap our minds around the complexity of one specific skill, but the number of influences and changes that are possible.
Yeah, I mean, this is I can see why this is called the philosophical podcast, because that is a seriously good question to discuss, and I mean, it is something I'm trying to wrap my head around a bit now. And earlier on, Joshua, you talked about this idea that what keeps somebody going, and what in terms of becoming an expert in an area, and I think it's about not accepting that we know things and we understand things, but to constantly question things and to find out if we can do things better. In many cases, we are in a good space and we're doing things quite well. But I'm talking about the very, very small improvements and refinements that someone could make to their practice and their skills and the way that they, coach and teach, for example. And it's the same with me. I've in the last few years, I started to go back to the literature. I'm sorry, but I'm going to take you back into the past again, where we're talking about the specificity of learning principle or the specificity of practice principle. It's been such a well-founded principle of learning, of teaching in PE, in coaching. It's something that, I was taught early on, and it is a very important principle that which I've talked about before. But I think what's happened is that over the years, the idea of what I call generality of practice, that is, by generality, let me just define that for people. What I'm talking about there is, if you like, not just practicing weightlifting movements, but practicing movements that are in other sports or physical activities or practice conditions. They may be practice tasks, but they're designed to help you become better at some sort of target movement or target sport, such as weightlifting, such as playing soccer, such as climbing, that sort of thing. And that's what I mean by generality of movement. And sometimes you can do that in unstructured situations. So with young children, for example, a lot of play activities, allowing them to explore and to play in an unstructured way. And that is not overseen and directly, constantly corrected by a coach or teacher. And of course, other times you can have more general practice experiences in a more structured way. So you can actually learn to play volleyball or learn to play badminton or tennis or whatever. And it's about how the movements needed in those conditions can help you to become better in some sort of target sport. I went back to the literature back into the 50s and even the 1940s. And what I notice about the title of the paper, so let me just start by saying a lot of the work was done in the US, and there was some fantastic work done in the PE community. And a lot of the people that were academics in the PE community they had scientific skills, they had engineering skills, they had technology skills, and they were very, very good as scientists. But for some reason, and I can explain the reason, I will in a minute, the question of specificity and generality of practice was set up as a juxtaposition. And by that, I mean, it's either or. Mm-hmm. So they looked at, instead of looking at the specificity of practice, specificity of learning, and the generality of practice, generality in learning, they didn't look at it in a complementary way. How can one support the other? And when should we be helping people to engage in more general physical activities and play activities and experiences to enrich them as movers? And I know you both alluded to that earlier in this podcast. And it was just set up as an either or. And the reason why they did it was because they wanted to develop tests for deciding whether they could select. It goes back to that question. Remember when I was talking about when I was talking about the engineers and the psychologists coming together in the war effort? Can we train people or can we select them? Well, to select people, you need a good test. And so the specificity principle became to dominate because they wanted to design better tests to identify whether somebody was going to be a good footballer. So if I could test you on using 10 different tests, the result, the score that I get, can that push you towards, well, I think, you need to go and play football. You need to go and practice and become good at football. You could be a good power lifter, that sort of thing. It was really about selection. And I think that took us down a path that was maybe detrimental, because what I think, and this is what I've tried to do in the last few years in my writings, is to develop theoretical ideas which has specificity and generality on the continuum. And so at one end, you'd have specific activities and practices and conditions for a particular task, such as weightlifting, for example. And then at the other end, you'd have more general activities that were further away from weightlifting. And my ideas that we've provided some support for, and we're looking at in terms of coaching and teaching, is for each individual, you can move them up and down that continuum towards a more specific end in your practice design, or towards more general activities, depending on their needs. And so if we take it back to, and I'll hand over to you two guys to talk about that from a coaching perspective in a minute, what it means is that if you really are concerned about somebody, you think that, we can work on their ankle strength, or we can work on their balance, their postural control, their dynamic balance, that sort of thing. Well, are there any general activities that they can do? And of course, they can do this in their spare time away from you. This is what I mean by unstructured play and practice, that will help them to develop the kind of systems needed so that when they come to lift a weight in a certain way, you will have empowered them. You would have enriched them. And this is what I'm talking about, is the enrichment of an individual with some general activities that allow them to train in a more powerful way.
Do you think so my mind immediately went to like the periodization of training, because it seemed to come along just shortly after they were looking at the generality versus specificity question. Do you think periodization answered some of those questions, and how to incorporate the generalization with the specificity in like a more planned approach?
Yeah, I think so. I think that can help you in terms of the here and now, the time scale of, for example, this week, or preparation for a competition, a tournament coming up, or even a season, planning a season. But you could go back even further, because you can talk about development, the coaching for development, developing an athlete as a lifter. And I don't just mean from very young. I mean someone who may have transferred from another sport, and trying to help them to develop to become the best that they can be in a different sport, for example. But also when you're differentiating development from preparing for performance. So the periodization thing clearly needs to take into account when you're preparing for a performance that's just coming up, etc. And you don't really want to be exploring things and really getting an athlete to grapple with variability, leading to confusion in the build-up to a competition. But on the other hand, there are some athletes, even that are kind of at a highly skilled level, that you could look at them and you could think, I wonder if I could help them to become better movers, so that even in practice and training, they can take advantage of that time. And it goes back to the point that was made earlier about being effective and efficient in the way that we use time. Imagine enriching somebody so that when they go back to specific training, they're almost like turbocharged, because they're able to take advantage of the wonderful exercises and activities that you can expose them to, and the environments and the problems and challenges to solve, because they've worked on certain aspects that they've needed to work on. And this is obviously where you may be able to give some examples from weightlifting from your own experiences, if you like.
Yeah, I'm wondering, based on because my mind again immediately goes to the skill level of the athlete, and then how that spectrum, or the use of the spectrum, general to specific, can change based on and I might be kind of butchering this, but based on like how concrete the skill is, or how concrete their execution of the skill is. So say we have someone who's been practicing a skill for a very long time, and it has become habit to perform it one particular way. Does that change the amount of effort or work needed to really drastically alter it? And then, are you moving along that sliding scale of generality and specificity differently? Or I guess my question a little bit more pointedly is, how does it change between expert and beginner, and more like concrete skill versus something that's more malleable?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's another good semi-philosophical point really to consider. The short answer is I don't know the full answer to that, because I'm still exploring it. But I think that your question raises the idea that there may be different ways to use variability in practice and different, i.e. more general activities. And one way could be to destabilize a very, very rigid, fixed movement pattern, which if you destabilize it slightly would allow it to become a bit more fluid and adaptable. So from, the ecological perspective that I pursue, which is that the brain isn't a computer, but really the basis of motor learning, skill acquisition, is a person developing a more functional relationship with a performance environment. And you can carry on developing that. You can carry on improving it, refining it, enriching it. And it goes back to the issue of expertise that we talked about before. You can carry on gaining expertise all the time because the sport or activity is dynamic, it's changing, equipment's changing, new ideas are coming in, venues are changing, there may be new formats of activities and stuff like that. So, people have to adapt along to it. So I guess that for me, one of the important things is that in these general activities or enrichment activities, as I'd like to call it, can be used in different ways. And they, all of the ways, though, should have a fairly straightforward rationale, which is to empower the athlete, to help them to become better athletes, better movers, broaden their repertoire, and maybe make them less rigid. So sometimes to slightly destabilize a situation so that you can get in and allow them to become more adaptive. Now, look, with some people, you're going to find that that's going to be a hard challenge, a tough nut to crack. And I think everybody knows that with, for individual differences. So that's why it's important to get that in early, to get people experiencing this sort of adaptive variability and different sort of situations and contexts, very early in training. And so that later on in training, it's just the normal. They're used to that and they understand it. In fact, we've been writing papers recently where we talking about co-design. The athlete works with the coach to say, I'm not comfortable with this. I really am underconfident. And the coach might say, yeah, I think you look all right about it. But if the athlete's saying, can articulate why it is that they don't feel happy with a certain aspect of performance, then, it's wonderful for engagement and motivation to co-design with an athlete a practice task that challenges them. So it's about putting in challenges, problems, varying the information. That's the basic thing, varying the information that's present in the environment. So if you put objects in the way so that if they do move their leg out to the right or to the left, beyond a certain bandwidth tolerance, then they will touch something, and that gives them information that their posture is too far away. And you can do that with a mirror, of course, but then in competition, there's no mirror there. And so they've got to learn not to rely just on visual information, visual feedback, but other sources of feedback as well. And then gradually learn, what a particular leg position means for them in a situation. And so I think that this is where coaching skills and experience and knowledge and that of the athlete as well, their skills and experience and knowledge really needs to meet with the motor learning theorist, the skill acquisition specialist, where you can design new tasks to, use that sort of, that approach, that sort of general enrichment approach in lots of different ways, some of which I haven't even thought about, to be honest.
Yeah. Kevin, I know you have a question. I just wanted to quickly get in and ask about destabilizing a skill, because again, this is a sport where we, and Kevin can, contest to this. This is a sport where we get people where they're at, right? So we don't hand pick, we don't have a system, we don't have a funnel, we have no way of choosing who we coach or how we coach them. It's kind of someone walks in, and if you want to provide for yourself, you kind of accept them kind of as the athlete, and that can be with incredible movement, incredible technical efficiency, or very, very poor technical efficiency. With that being said, if someone walks in, and I have a girl who I'm working with very closely, and her movement was very inefficient. She did a lot of foundational things very poorly, and it's taken a lot of work and a lot of reps, a lot of time, changing movements, just being hyper focused on certain aspects of it to actually make a noticeable difference. To where I'm kind of proud of that. And I don't know if we could expedite that or make it happen quicker, but when we talk about destabilizing a skill, what exactly does that mean, and what does that look like in the context of trying to reintroduce a different or more efficient movement?
Yeah, I think coaches and teachers need to be careful how they do this, because destabilizing might lead to certain unsafe situations, situations where people can become injured. So for example, I'll give you an example. This is something that we're pursuing. It's related to sport and physical activity, but it's nothing to do with weightlifting, weight training. Think of it this way. When people learn to swim, they normally learn to swim in a very calm indoor environment, warm water, ambient temperature quite stable, bright lighting, you can see everything, etc. And you've got this graded movement of the slope of an incline of the pool down to the deep end. But where do most drownings occur in real life? They occur outdoors, in rivers, in streams. And across the world, you find that young children and adolescents, young people, their numbers are amongst the drowners as well. And what's more, so-called competent swimmers are amongst the people who drown in outdoor environments. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes the way that people learn skills, or where the context where they learn skills, doesn't prepare them for performing that skill in every environment. So to go back to your point about destabilizing a movement coordination pattern, you have to approach that very carefully. You have to work with the athlete to co-design it. And the idea is not to completely deconstruct it and start from fresh. The idea really is that you should kind of create situations, constraints, if you like, manipulate task constraints, manipulate conditions where the learner has to adapt and start slowly, start with very small changes and adaptations required, but gradually, learn to help people to learn to sort of vary things. So you vary things, you add in variability there so that they cannot perform the movement in the way that they want to, which is, in this very rigid way. Because if conditions didn't change, I'm sure that they would be fine. Most people would be fine. But, you find that conditions do change. The barbell becomes slippery. The floor becomes slippery. The lighting's not very good, or, there's all sorts of things. You guys would know what varies in weightlifting much more than I. And so with a performer that comes in, they've got very rigid technique. It's about being patient and just sifting in variability of context in different ways. It could be using different barbells, getting them out of their comfort zone so they become familiar with just adapting and adjusting and learning, and just increasing that, making that those changes a bit more extensive. And then you start to break things down, and then they start to, reorganize their actions. So if we go back to this notion of coordination, essentially what you do when you coordinate your actions is you organize your movements, you organize your degrees of freedom, the parts of the body that you need to actually achieve that action, the muscles, the joints, the limbs, etc. And so maybe as a coach, you should think about reorganization, i.e. adapting. And with that will help you to produce the sort of manipulations to the conditions which that particular learner can start to readapt, reorganize and adjust. And that is the way that you can destabilize the movement enough for them to build it up again in a slightly different way.
Now I have a million thoughts. So like the first thing that came to my mind when we were talking about the destabilization of movement is like a baseball player when they hit a slump, right? They'll change their position in the batter's box. They'll choke up in the box. They change the way that they're like perceiving that initial input, right? So they're changing something up within their environment that just kind of gives them a fresh look, so to speak. And then, maybe you could comment on that a little bit first, and then I have another question.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the point I made before, is I think that it would be interesting for coaches and teachers to think about not changing things up only when players, performers or learners are in a bit of a slump. In other words, think of a situation where you had a performance environment, and you know what can vary in that performance environment, where you didn't allow the learner to just turn the handle on things. You didn't allow them to stay in a comfort zone, so that you might sort of say, well, I'll take a soccer example. So you might say, in the morning, we're going to do 11 versus 11 practice. And then they get there, and then what you do is actually you do 3 versus 3 or 2 versus 2, 5 versus 5. Now, the aim is not to completely confuse the learner, but it's to keep them on their toes, to make them, really think about what they're doing and to engage with it and to adapt, because that's what opponents do. That's what venues and challenges do to you. You have to, think on your feet. You have to adapt. You have to be out of your comfort zone. You have to continually reorganize. And it's not just your movements. It's also your thoughts, your emotions, your feelings, the information that you perceive. You need to be, ready like that. And so perhaps you want to pick it up again, Kevin, from that. So if a learner is constantly challenged, then it's not going to be something that happens only when there's a slump or only when there's some sort of issue, and it might be an emotional problem or something like that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Now, there's a certain amount of error that's just within the system itself, right? If you look at a basketball player, they don't shoot 100% from the free throw line, even though it's basically it's the same distance, same weight of the ball, same rim. Yeah. So there's some just typical error that occurs within the movement system. And I know me earlier on as a coach, I think I viewed all error as being incorrect and poor. And there's a certain amount that's just going to occur naturally. And then there's a certain amount that probably differentiates levels of skill within certain things and stuff. And like one of the things that I've been like really wrestling with lately is the idea of deliberate practice, because what part of variability do you think is just when you get an athlete that is just cognitively and physically in the moment in a training session? I feel there's almost, no matter what you do at that point, there's just a lot of benefit to it. I mean, obviously within reason, if I'm having a power lifter play tennis, that's a little bit different. But like, as long as they're like involved in the moment within that training session, just fully involved in it, I think there's a lot of carryover to it. And there seems to be a lot of individuality between how long somebody can focus and actually be involved, whether it's motivational factors and how much they actually want to participate in the sport. There's genetic factors, there's whatever it may be, stress of life in general. Maybe their work's really stressful, so their amount of focus and attention that they can put into a training session becomes very limited. And we get stuck on, especially in weightlifting and powerlifting, there's like these recommended volumes that are kind of based off of, the Russians and Bulgarians and Greeks, and they were all self-selected at some point. But they're doing these, it's like this amount of volumes necessarily to get better, and kind of, repetition for the sake of repetition at some point, and not everybody has that same capability. And I'm just curious, perhaps on some comments from both of you guys, even on the thoughts of deliberate practice.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly follow up with that and say that's kind of what I've been thinking about too, is like the processing power of the athlete and how much can you give them to positively impact the same thing, right? So what keeps me from giving 3 different variations of the same thing to improve the skill versus giving 2 versus giving 1? And then at what point do you switch to more general features of the athlete, like just improving rate of force development, just improving absolute strength, and transitioning away from something that's cognitively demanding or more demanding of the skill of the actual kind of performance task. I mean, I've been wrestling with that same question. So
yeah, so perhaps like generality can come when focus has decreased a little bit.
Right.
It require as much cognitive awareness.
I think they're really good examples, and I think they show that there's a lot of coaching encouraged by motor learning theory, which has tried to categorize athletes together all the time. Take a one-size-fits-all approach. So you're never going to become expert unless you undergo an average of 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, for example, when the results, the data show that that's not the case, that some people become chess masters after reporting 3,200 hours of practice, and others, it took 23,000 hours of practice. And it goes back to our earlier discussions when we looked at other people and said, how come I can't be as good as that person? And I seem to practice every hour going, and that person is, way better than me on certain things. There are these individual differences that will occur and emerge in different ways. And so I think it's really about needs. It's on a needs base for each athlete. I really like the example of the athlete where they're in the moment, they're in the flow, they're really enjoying the practice. Then why interrupt it? Specificity of practice is going well. Why interrupt it if it's happy? If they're happy with it. Others, after 15 minutes on a certain day, it's not going well, and maybe it's about changing things and altering things, and maybe a motivational thing or whatever. And that's where you really need to understand your individual athlete in terms of and look for patterns of behavior. Is demotivation something that's a pattern there constantly, or is it just really a spike because something's gone on at work, or that sort of thing? And so expect a lot of individual differences, a lot of individual variations, and this is where the coach. This goes back to what I was talking about. This athlete coach co-designing together. You engage the athlete so that they have ownership of their, of their own trajectory, their own career, their own development. And that doesn't mean that they're going to practice at 100% every time, etc. But, are there things that they can be doing that can help them? Maybe it's just a bit of fatigue or some sort of mental fatigue or something like that. That's an issue. So it's really about working with each individual, co-designing together, maybe a program of work, engaging them in it, and they're participants in their own, in their own learning. And to go back to it, I guess one of the points about coaching from this ecological approach is that we are really trying to foster an athlete-centered approach. And by that, we mean that the athlete learns to self-regulate. Because when they're in competition, when they're out there and you're not there, they need to be able to self-regulate. That means that they need to be able to, focus on what they're doing, to warm up properly, etc. Any coach that is constantly correcting, constantly telling the athlete what to do is doing the regulation for the athlete. But there comes a time really when from very early on, you can use simple examples of self-regulation where they take their own warm-up. They're responsible for getting themselves ready for practice. They're responsible for how they are in practice and competition. In fact, they're so responsible, they're working with you to design some practice things where they feel that they need some more, to give a simple example, some more upper body work or some more core strength work or whatever, as long as they can explain it. It's not just a sort of, I feel that I do. It's more a case of being able to explain why and have a discussion with you. And I think that would put the athlete and the coach actually in a very good position there, working together like that.
Yeah. So I kind of had a thought there just quickly. It's almost like what I could do instead of, because there are certain expectations with coaches nowadays, and this could have been before my time, I don't know. But since I've started, athletes want everything kind of written out and explained entirely and done for them. This goes for in-person and remote. They want a plan. They want all of the exercises, all of the sets, all of the reps. And, it makes it hard to convince them that like, hey, you having some autonomy ultimately will probably end with the best result. So if I gave you just 20 minutes before a session and say, hey, let's do some low level work, don't like add too much weight so it's actually fatiguing, physically fatiguing, but just choose movements that you feel help. You feel the bar or feel the movement, or kind of explore different grip widths or foot placements. Like just have 20 minutes before a session as a designated block of kind of like autonomous practice. That to me makes more sense than just always prescribing things that I think make sense or that fit, or giving like 3 sets of 2 repetitions, like, and that's it. And that's the hard cutoff, because I don't know how to predict that. I don't know how to choose that. I don't know how it feels. So it kind of makes sense talking to you that you would almost leave things more open-ended, put more responsibility on their shoulders to kind of explore different strategies versus always being the dictator or the director.
I think that's it. Is to, it needs to be done in a subtle way, but ask questions, ask how they feel, and give them small periods. I mean, you really don't want to go into co-design straight away,
right,
and put them right on the spot, as you say, particularly if they've never been used to it, or there's a certain expectation that you instruct them and then you lead everything. Then it's just going to fall apart, because it's, as you say, there's expectations and that sort of thing, and perceptions of what coaching is. Mm-hmm. So yeah, just take the opportunity to sort of back off a little bit and give them time. So I know, for example, that there are football coaches who say to the players, right, go and get yourself warmed up, 15 minutes, go through the activities. We're going to do a session on shooting, etc. So just get ready for that. And then, so that the players go off and they know what to do. And if they can, you can even ask them to, in certain sessions where they come prepared to actually contribute to the session. I know that, for example, the Great Britain hockey team, field hockey team, they used to have certain sessions where the players led the session. They specifically were told to design practice tasks were related, and so they were challenged like that. And initially there was a bit of resistance to it. They didn't know what to do, but then certain people really adapted to it quite quickly, and so they learned to to really embrace that opportunity to design practice tasks and work on things that they wanted to work on. Sometimes those things wouldn't work well. That was accepted, because they're not coaches, but they learned from it. And it's very much giving the message over to them that, they're self-regulating. You're the one who's driving your own development and learning and improvement. I'm here to help you to become the best that you can be, but it's down to you. And I think, subtly supporting that message in lots of different ways. You gave a couple of really good examples, I think, Joshua, and I think that can be done from early on as well.
I think for me, when I first started trying to have more of a learner-centered approach, I just kind of gave them too much of the reins. So there is a certain amount of work and a certain amount of guidance that's necessary in order for them to achieve the success in which they need. There's a reason why the coach is the expert and guide in that, based off of their experiences and knowledge and everything else. And what I learned over time was basically I'm making up these numbers, but 2/3 of it I write down and I'm like, this is what we need to do. But there's a third of it that I leave open to uncertainty. So we have team meetings every 2 weeks where we kind of discuss training decisions and all of these things. So I think of the program I write out, but at the same time, as they're going through it, if things don't feel right or they feel better than expected, usually I made the mistake of giving them the reins when things feel better than expected, and it just throws off some stuff sometimes. But they have to make good decisions in the gym based off of the feedback they're getting from a certain training day. So if things don't feel right, doing the squats, they're my knee's a little achy. I'm going to just cut the squats here, but I'm going to push the good mornings after it. Or hit my general conditioning stuff hard. I'm going to do my belt squat marches because they don't hurt it. I leave the decision making up to them. and they screw it up more often than not. But then it becomes this discussion and this learning process. And like over time, like now when we have our team meetings, there's just a lot more educated lifters who are like, hey, this happened to me in training. I was able to do this, and here was my workaround. Here's what I felt helped me through the last few months of training that allowed to the progress that I had on my lift. And it just becomes this, not only this like coach, with one-on-one coach-athlete relationship, but it even like involves a much larger like dynamic. And I have found that for the practical application of some of these things is the coach lays down the plan, but the decision making of that like degree of uncertainty needs to be up to the lifter, and their education experience within the sport obviously dictates how well those decisions go, but like not to be afraid of allowing them to make mistakes in the gym to learn from so that they make better decisions later on.
Mm-hmm. I really like that example there, because yeah, you're absolutely right. What I'm not saying, and I want to be quite clear about this, is I'm not saying that coaches should dive in at the deep end and start giving away autonomy and expecting all athletes to self-regulate, in an ideal way. Some will take to it really well, some will not like it one bit. So you can rein things back, but you can still give some very simple opportunities for people to develop these skills over time. And if they respond well, you can carry on just sort of pushing the boundaries on it, etc. But clearly, you have boundaries. You have boundaries and thresholds in terms of providing information, for the athletes. So I think the key issue from a theoretical viewpoint is that the ecological approach suggests that learners improve and should improve in practice by picking up information. Normally, it's the information from the performance environment. So it's external sources of information that they pick up from the environment, and that guides their movements, their coordination of the action. And an augmented source of information comes from the coach. Now, the point is that it's an augmented, meaning additional source of information that is not there during performance. Sometimes coaches can't intervene at critical periods, so you can't get learners to depend on you too much. So that when they have to make decisions, when they have to show self-regulation, when they have to decide what to do, solve problems, etc., they have to rely on themselves. So, good responsible coaching is about providing the support for them, the augmented information that they need when they need it, but also being very sensitive to their needs in terms of not giving their support, not giving the support that they want when it's good for them. So in other words, they may look to you and say, I'll give you an example. I had a colleague who observed it was a paddle canoeing type of activity where there was they would go through this sort of there was like a flue that was specifically designed for whitewater rapids. The individuals would perform a set of movements, then come out at the end of this flume and walk and stand by the coach. The coach would be looking at the laptop, and literally sometimes the coach wouldn't even look at the athlete. So after about 30 seconds or whatever, 20 seconds, the athlete would then just go and start again. And you just think that is just almost like conditioned into expecting feedback. If there was something to say, the coach could say it. Otherwise, you just think about it, the athlete, that is, you go through and think, what didn't work well? What do I need to work on? So the next trial that you go back, because that's what happens in competition. And I guess that's the guiding thing there. So it's absolutely right, Kevin, that, you do have boundaries, you do have coaches available, and they provide that augmented information. But the important point is not to become a crutch for them to lean on when they really, in competition, they haven't got that opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to hear the athletes' feedback from me for me when, they take a lift or they execute an exercise and they look over and maybe I'm looking away, or I just kind of stare at them, and they almost have a conditioned response to how I don't respond, and they think, oh, you didn't like it, or is there something wrong, or are you mad, or So it's really interesting to pick up on all of the athlete feedback and hear and think about how they perceive the session to go. And I guess as a coach, that's how I've you kind of pick this up with time, is how to pick up the signal and the noise. So another example is the girl I was talking about earlier, who was really resistant to developing improved technical efficiency. She said something and she mentioned just kind of off the cuff that she really likes this exercise and it tends to help. And I kind of like tucked that away, and I didn't say anything about it. We didn't have a conversation. I just remember now that the next time we're looking to work on these things, this is something she enjoys or gets a lot out of. And I think the subtle art of coaching is just picking up on those small cues that in a normal conversation seem meaningless, but in the context of kind of athlete development or a training plan, they can kind of take you to that next level with movement efficiency and picking things that help kind of boost the enjoyment of the session and all those things. So that's kind of why I like it. And you just kind of pick up on the layers to the art and skill of coaching as you go. It's things you never really think about or thought about from the outset. And I think this is what this conversation has done, is it's laid this groundwork of concepts and ideas and strategies that we all maybe know about or do or implement, but maybe we don't explicitly bring them up and talk about them in the context of theory and practice.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's where a good theory can help. A good theory can help you to make sense of those things a little bit. I'm not saying it will solve any problems for you or tell you what to do, but it may just make you stimulate your thinking to make sense of a comment, a throwaway comment, or a look, as you say, the non-verbal interaction with athletes, I guess, and between athletes and coaches. It can just help you to sort of exploit that and use that in a positive way. Just one thing that I wanted to it was a comment that Kevin made, and I wanted to just clarify what I mean by that. When I talk about general activities, I'm sorry if this sounds a bit different, a bit random, but it is building on our conversations. Some of I talked about the if you look at specificity and generality on a continuum, which is complementary. So in other words, some activities are more complementary to your target sport than other activities. It's important that you can play these sorts of lots of different activities and sports. Let's call them multi-sports. They're more varied. You can play them, and that's really about helping you to become a better mover, more effective in your movements, and building up your repertoire. Then there's a group of activities that may be closer to your target sport, but not actually your target sport, if you like, which they will really kind of strengthen some of the things that you do, and really almost like the transfer that goes on there would be very positive. And a simple example, I'm talking about where you're playing soccer, 11-a-side soccer, and a sport that's really closely related could be futsal. And you play that, and you can see the futsal players in soccer because they manipulate the ball in a very elegant way and effective way, and they can keep the ball away from opponents, and they use their body in different ways, etc. So some sports are going to have less relevance to your target sport, but they're just going to give you a broader movement repertoire more generally, improve your confidence, help you to become better at perceiving information from the environment and self-regulating in a dynamic, highly physical active environment. So I wouldn't want coaches to think that all those general activities had the same status. Some are closer to your target sport, some are slightly further away.
Mm-hmm. I think too, there's a tie-in to just because there's a psychological component to it too, right? So if somebody's scared of big weights and they're scared of public speaking, and you force them to if I make them talk in front of the entire group, like I do think that there's still carryover, even though it seems like they're two completely unrelated tasks. Like one's physical, one's not. But that even that psychological component of just doing something you're uncomfortable with at times, I think carry over to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, getting out your comfort zone, being out of your comfort zone. And of course, there's a step in between. So you can get that person to talk to 2 or 3 athletes and you and another athlete, for example, before they are then pushed out of their comfort zone to talk to the wider group. I think that as a principle, if you can introduce that early so that athletes learn what it's like to be out of their comfort zone, sometimes marginally out of their comfort zone, sometimes quite away from it, then that is good for them in general, because what they learn then is pretty much to get switched on, to be thinking, to be working out what needs to be done, to have a bit of a plan, etc., to solve problems, to make decisions. And that is good for them when things don't go to plan. For example, when you go to a competition venue and it's not at all what you expected. And I think that's the value, the benefit of those sorts of experiences.
It goes to life too, right? Like that's how sport kind of helps you improve just, I think, normal life skills in general.
Yeah. I did want to just touch on a last comment kind of before we wrap up, is that Keith, you talked about theory and kind of its role and how you can understand it in the application, within an actual like sporting context. And I'll say as someone who's I won't say mostly self-taught, but I have had to do a lot of my learning kind of reading stuff from other people and watching other people and just kind of being in the trenches, making a lot of errors and kind of seeing what happens. It's been a very messy process. And I found that I lean a lot on the theory to help provide some sort of structure or foundation because I never really came up under a coach who had some system in place. It's been very much me observing systems and trying to kind of reverse engineer them and then apply them into a very specific context, which obviously sounds inefficient, but that's just the path that I've taken. So your work, I have a paper actually probably pulled up now of yours just because, I'm interested in it and I think it can help me in some way. So I think for kind of as different exercises work better and worse for certain people, I think, having the amount of theory and then the amount of kind of practical experience, different people rely on different doses of either to kind of formulate a strategy. And I've certainly leaned a lot on the theory. So I wanted to thank you a lot for your work because it's changed the way I view, learning, training, and coaching in a meaningful way. So thanks.
That's a pleasure. And actually, that is so motivating for me. So at the beginning, we started off this conversation by talking about expertise and how do we carry on, trying to improve and get better. It's comments like that when I go back to my lockdown life for the next few months and carry on writing in the morning, and I'm writing papers, etc. It's comments like that drive me to think about, have I captured this sentence or paragraph, this description in the right way? Is it too full of jargon? Can I make it more practical? And so I learn a lot as well. And the latest theorizing we're talking about is actually how to incorporate what I call experiential knowledge. That is the knowledge that you guys gain from working with athletes day in, day out, every hour. The small things that you just, the example you gave, Josh, about the throwaway comment, etc. All of that can feed back in because a theory is useful as a framework, but the experiential knowledge also brings it to life with practical examples and opportunities. So I'd like to thank you guys for the work that you're doing as well in the field.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, Kevin, I suppose I'll give you the honors first. And again, this was kind of like I always come into podcasts and I don't necessarily know what to expect because I got away from like rigid outlines once I felt confident enough in my ability to talk about a topic for an hour and a half. So it's always kind of a mystery and kind of cool to see it unfold like this. I think this is definitely one of my favorite podcasts I've probably ever recorded, to be completely honest. So Kevin, if people heard this and they're interested in knowing more about powerlifting or your approach to powerlifting, integrating ideas that Keith has spoken about with respect to kind of the constraints-led approach to skill acquisition and all of that good stuff, where can they find your accounts and then also the information that you put out on a pretty regular basis?
So Instagram I use pretty frequently. So it's KWCann, CANN. And our powerlifting team's Precision Powerlifting Systems. I put a lot of other information up on my Patreon channel. So it's patreon.com/precision powerlifting. And that's more just me explaining like my thought process and more often than not how I fuck up doing this stuff and basically go forward with it.
Yeah, and as someone who's gone through all of the videos in a very short amount of time, I will say there's not an absence of information or content there. So go check that out. That'll be linked down below. And then Keith, if people are interested in reading more about your work, getting up to speed with what you've done and what you're doing, where can they find all of that stuff?
Yeah, we tend to write articles in academic journals. There may be psychology, human movement science journals, that sort of thing. I wouldn't start with those because they're more targeted at theoretical issues. And if you're interested in practical issues, there's a lot of good coaching science journals and practical articles. And I can send you some PDFs that you can distribute to readers, to listeners if they would like that. Otherwise, just the listeners can Google it online and just start with the practical coaching activities and those articles. And it doesn't matter if it's in a sport that's not related to lifting or anything like that, because the same principles can be applied, although there are specific constraints, as you said, that may vary.
Yeah, and I mean, I've spent a lot of time, and I go out of my way to look at, scientific articles and read them, and try to understand kind of the theoretical concepts, how they're being discussed amongst yourself, like academics, and then also to listen to podcasts that you happen to come on, which help, I think, bridge that. Like, for example, the one you did with Kevin, the one you did with Robbie Burke. But, how do you see us creating a funnel for this information? Because again, there is that barrier of you either have a subscription to a journal or you're able to sift through the jargon or to read the scientific papers. I know, Kevin and I, we're trying to do something about introducing these concepts and ideas to coaches who are interested. But do you think there's a more effective way to get, the information from people studying it, in a lab and then to people on the field? Do you see any avenues or constraints there?
I think that the way things are going in the last few years is pretty good, actually. I think that luckily we're not relying on lab-based studies. I'm not saying that all lab-based studies are irrelevant, but often the constraints of a lab-based study can lead to some artificial findings. It's like, for example, people who use animal models to test theories of learning, and then what are the implications of applying that to human learning? There's a big jump to be made there, but luckily a lot of research is happening in sports environments, practical activity environments, PE environments, and I think that there's a lot of podcasts. It's a bit uneven. Some of the podcasts, not the ones I've been on, they've been very good actually. This one, the level of discussion is about as good as you can get, to be honest. It's really top notch, and it's a credit to you guys for being a sort of a up to date with what's going on in the field and being able to share your own experiences, and that's wonderful. And so, really, it's about people listening to good quality podcasts, following up, doing some reading, and just being critical. And I mean, even critical of some of the things that I've said or whatever, because as I said at the beginning, theories are dynamic entities. They're organic. They're developing and changing all the time. Some of the stuff that I'm working on now, I'm really excited about. Looking back, 10, 20 years, the stuff I wrote then is out of date, and I've moved on from then. And so it's important to see this thing as constantly changing and developing, and it's not just a sort of a inner box. You read it and that's it. You know it forever. It's evolving. And luckily at the moment, it's evolving because practitioners are contributing their insights in a very confident way to keep theorists, online, as it were, and on course, and not navigating off into sort of places that uncharted territories that where it may not be that useful to go. I'll just say this now. I do like the philosophical podcast label. I think that's great. That captures it nicely. So great stuff.
Yeah, thank you. And guys, I really appreciate both of your time that you've obviously dedicated to the podcast. This might be a personal record for me, is how long we've gone on for.
Right.
For everyone listening, if you really enjoyed it, go check out their stuff, support the guys. We're all able to do this because great people like yourself are willing to either pay us for our services or listen to us and give us some attention that helps kind of push us forward. So please do that. Leave a review, leave, a certain number of stars on iTunes. That apparently helps the podcast grow. And we will catch you guys next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.